A single notification blinked over Buckingham Palace's secure internal network in a terrifying moment that sent shivers down the palace's glittering hallways. Medical diagnosis confirmed. Louis the Prince. Long regarded as the monarchy's light-hearted spark, the youngest royal was abruptly at the center of a devastating revelation. One that had been buried beneath layers of regal secret. What was so scary that even senior royals froze in silence? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. There was no ceremony when the message arrived. There was no warning or preparedness. It arrived abruptly, stripped of comfort, carrying a weight that could not be lightened by protocol or tradition. Within seconds, phones buzzed behind closed doors, aides paused mid-step, and a quiet descended that felt heavier than any royal scandal before it. This was not a rumor floating in from newspapers or whispers shared through unknown channels. This was internal, verified, timestamp, marked urgent. The kind of confirmation that bypasses spin and strikes right at the center of power. A diagnosis, long discussed in shadows, has finally been acknowledged. No longer hypothetical, no longer containable. The statement 1 minute ago caused panic. Why now? Why now? Why don't you prepare? Staff workers who had served the family for decades would subsequently acknowledge they had never seen a notification generate such immediate upheaval. There was no justification for the cancellation of meetings. Doors were shut, entire floors were evacuated, as if the palace itself had gone into medical lockdown. Prince Louis's recent absence from public appearances now took on a considerably more foreboding aspect. What had been passed off as regular privacy for a growing youngster suddenly felt intentional. Every missed wave, every overlooked moment, every carefully phrased explanation began to shatter beneath the weight of this solitary confirmation. Inside the family, reactions divided swiftly. It was said that Catherine was distraught. As the reality she had carried with her for years suddenly came to light, she withdrew from all interaction. William, uncommonly inaccessible, vanished from internal communication lines. Fear was aroused not only for his son, but also for the future consequences of this revelation. He had been prepared for his entire life. And then came the most dangerous question of all. If this diagnosis was confirmed now, who forced it into the light? Was it a moral breaking point for a doctor sworn to silence? A purposeful leak from someone who could no longer stomach the deception? Or had the palace lost control of its own secrets, undone from inside by dread and guilt? Because this announcement did not merely uncover a medical fact. It opened open a hidden chapter the monarchy never meant the world to read. And when the shock rippled outward, one thing became painfully evident. The narrative of Prince Louis was never only about health. But this diagnosis was not merely a medical fact. It was the crown's most explosive liability, one they'd fought frantically to conceal for years. Royal watchers now raced to reevaluate prior footage, hunting for signals they overlooked. That limp in Louis's stride, the faint looks between William and Kate, the imperceptible retreat from public view. However, it wasn't shyness or awkwardness. It was the undetectable buildup to a terrible revelation, hidden in plain sight. The signs were dispersed like breadcrumbs in retrospect. In one official footage, Louis stumbles slightly while strolling across the courtyard. His mother steadied him quickly. At the time, it was dismissed as fun energy. But now, rewatched through the sharp perspective of hindsight, the stumble isn't innocuous. It's haunting. Close-ups indicate even more tiny shakes in his hand when waving, delays in speech when answering simple inquiries during public engagements, brief moments, easily unnoticed. However, it is now impossible to ignore. Those with sharp eyes and sharper memory now feel a cold pit in their gut. They saw it. They just didn't realize what they were witnessing. According to reports, palace employees who were sworn to secrecy were strictly instructed not to discuss what were internally referred to as tiredness episodes, a royal euphemism crafted to deflect attention from reoccurring problems. Speaking on condition of anonymity, a former footman recounted receiving criticism for merely inquiring as to whether Louis required more rest following an event. The message was plain. Questions were a menace. Even the royal nanny, previously considered as a permanent fixture in Louis's early upbringing, abruptly quit under what the palace claimed personal reasons. But those close to the issue tell a different narrative. There are rumors that she started to feel uneasy about the hush regarding Louis's condition. Her departure, sudden and unexplained, left a notable hole in the young prince's everyday routine and raised red lights for those watching attention. Catherine, ever the watchful mother, began discreetly moving back from public events, citing her wish to spend more time with her children. But insiders show it was considerably more than parental affection. She was attempting to protect Louis from the attention of the general population, protect him from the prying eyes of an overly perceptive world. Then, in late 2025, there was the tranquil trip to Switzerland. It was dubbed a family wellness resort by the palace, a quaint term disguising a far more somber fact. Louis was receiving a battery of testing at an exclusive neurodevelopmental facility recognized for handling high-profile cases away from public eyes. The medical professionals present weren't looking for solutions. They were monitoring progression. Inside royal walls, protocols shifted. Public engagements were reformed. Louis's camera angles were regulated. Staff were briefed to always stand close, always intervene immediately, and always under no circumstances allow him to appear vulnerable. But that's the awful paradox of secrecy. They may protect, but they also isolate. And while the public remained blissfully oblivious, behind closed doors, a war was being conducted, not against a foreign enemy, but a diagnosis that could change the monarchy itself. Buried in a limited access wing of the Royal Medical Archives sits the confidential file designated Project Solstice. Inside, years of testing, psychiatric examinations, and discreet consultations. The truth? Louis was diagnosed years ago but kept a state secret. Why? Because what lies in the file threatens the entire line of succession. There was no panic at the start of Project Solstice. It began with patterns, repeated symptoms that couldn't be ignored, episodes of confusion, slower response times, moments where Louis felt separated from his surroundings. By the time he was 3, the palace's internal physicians could no longer disregard the signals as normal developmental peculiarities. What followed was the establishment of a highly classified medical probe, hidden by layers of national security rhetoric and royal formality. The diagnosis was cruelly verified early. An uncommon degenerative neurological condition hardly recorded and barely understood. However, it is notorious for being vicious and unpredictable. Some patients stabilize for years before deteriorating. Others degrade rapidly before reaching adolescence. The outlook for Louis was like a ticking clock, counting down in silence as the world remained clueless. However, the palace opted for silence, rather than educating the people or even the larger government. Legal papers were immediately written, signed under the highest security clearances. Access to Louis's medical records was confined to a select handful. The public-facing physicians were replaced or reassigned. And then came the most terrifying move of all: overseas professionals who were transported in under fake identities. A pediatric neurogeneticist with connections to covert royal initiatives arrived from Sweden. From Canada, a child neurologist who had consulted for armies addressing high-risk cognitive problems. A doctor from Israel who specialized in the early identification of inherited neurodegenerative markers. Each of them signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements. None of them left a sign of their labor behind. And all of them agreed on one scary conclusion: the illness could damage both mental and motor functions. With no known treatment, the consequences were devastating not just for Louis, but for the monarchy's image of strength, continuity, and control. A future king with a deteriorating mind? A youngster whose illness could exclude him from state duties? The monarchy, still suffering from past decades of scandal, wasn't willing to gamble with another uncertain headline. It was King Charles, sources indicate, who made the ultimate order. The report would never reach Parliament, never be acknowledged formally, and never be allowed to affect concerns of succession. The file was sealed. Public inquiries were stonewalled. And from that day on, every medical measure taken for Louis was wrapped in royal invisibility. But secrets have a temperature. And as time passed, Project Solstice began to overheat. The truth blazed beneath the surface more and more as they buried it, until one member of the royal family made the decision to risk all. A royal insider who was once written off as a low-level nursery help has unleashed a shocking revelation. For years, they saw the lies rise, the practiced words, the fabricated paperwork, and finally, they couldn't stay silent. Their anonymous disclosure to a worldwide health agency breached the wall of silence. They were never supposed to matter, hired covertly, never named publicly, and assigned the position of supplementary support. This assistance was expected to fade into the background, present, but invisible. But they witnessed everything: the private medical visits that were passed off as normal examinations, the whispered instructions amongst workers, the way Louis was subtly trained before every rare public appearance. His hand gestures were pre-rehearsed, his reply memorized. Even the duration of his time in front of cameras was strictly monitored, down to the minute. And the aide documented it all. Over months, they created a thorough log timings of medication, behavior shifts, sudden cancellations. Every deviation, every hushed conversation outside the nursery door was noted. More than just a diary, it became a record of royal suppression. Hidden inside were not simply clinical patterns, but emotional ones. They wrote of how Catherine would often linger at Louis's bedside long after lights out, softly wiping away tears. How her pleasant demeanor in public shattered in private, as she appealed with doctors for better answers and was treated with icy protocol. One entry stood out above all: a confrontation between William and senior royal advisors. The aide had been within earshot, as the heir to the throne exclaimed, "He's my son first." Not a sign, not a narrative. The remark was censored in all official transcripts, but stored forever in the aide's personal notes, showing that even inside the firm, the struggle between duty and parenthood was raging. But it was the tapes that would finally bring the monarchy's curtain of secrecy crashing down. Using a secret recorder sewn into the inner of their clothing, the assistant collected hours of audio, staff workers encouraging Louis to disguise physical symptoms, whispering commands, ridiculing public perception. The final trigger occurred when the palace allegedly threatened to move Louis to a long-term institution abroad. That night, the aide sent a single encrypted email to a European medical ethics authority, including recordings, records, and one disturbing question: what happens when royalty outweighs medical ethics? Within 48 hours, international agencies were alerted. The file went popular in underground forums. Journalists hurried to verify the source, and when the first transcript was published, the world could no longer look away. If the royal family could hide this, what else had they buried? Now speculation spreads like wildfire. Are there additional children with suppressed diagnoses? Was this genuinely about Louis? Or has the palace followed this playbook before? And more dangerously, how far were they willing to go to maintain the idea of perfection? But as the world reels from the betrayal within, attention goes to the woman who has carried this secret like a silent burden for years. Behind the calm smile and precisely fitting jackets, Catherine was waging a silent war. Every public appearance hid the misery of witnessing her youngest kid sink into doubt. Now, stripped of privacy, her world collapses in the glare of public scrutiny and private anguish. For years, she struggled in silence. But now, the leaked pages of her private medical journal lay bare a truth more devastating than any royal scandal. Catherine documented her fear of each unknown ailment in her own handwriting, the fear of each hushed consultation. One entry reads simply, "He lost his own name today." Another ends with just 2 words, "I'm breaking." These weren't the words of a future queen. They were the sobs of a mother drowning in powerlessness. When palace medics recommended an experimental treatment, one not approved by regulatory boards, Catherine refused. She wouldn't allow her son to become a royal experiment, not in order to maintain control of the story. Her stance upset royal advisors and provoked intense disputes behind the scenes. It wasn't just disagreement, it was a mutiny. And when Charles and Camilla allegedly persuaded her to reconsider for the crown's future, she did what no one expected. She pushed back hard. Insiders describe a terrifying occasion in early 2025. Catherine, just before hitting the stage at the Commonwealth Gala, collapsed in tears backstage. Cameras captured none of it. But aides who watched the collapse say she grabbed Louis's medical papers in her hands, unwilling to release go. She gave an amazing speech that same evening, smiling as though nothing had happened. The people never knew. But those closest to her never forgot. And then came the moment that actually shook the palace. Her decision to take Louis from his royal school, without consultation, without permission. She withdrew him from the institution bound so tightly to royal tradition. Her message was plain. Louis was no longer a symbol, he was a child, and she would not allow him to be paraded or politicized. What followed was chaos. Advisors panicked. Press teams scrambled. Aides warned her she was harming the family's togetherness. Whispers of mutiny whispered around the corridors, but Catherine didn't flinch. She'd reached a point of no return. In fact, one senior official claimed she drafted a formal resignation letter, ready to completely leave the life of a royal. William was the one who stopped her, not with orders but with a fervent appeal, not as the future king, but as the father of their child. Because Catherine's defiance was an attempt to keep her son from being overtaken by the monarchy rather than to overthrow it. Every sleepless night, every public falsehood. The palace was never ready to deal with the simmering wrath and maternal disobedience that resulted from every choice she took against her instincts. And while Catherine defended her son with every ounce of her strength, others within the palace saw only one thing: a threat to the monarchy's reputation. Prince William is at a crossroads. Few could imagine his role as future king conflicting brutally with his job as a father, with royal advisors hovering like vultures and the people shouting for answers. William is forced into a decision no parent should contemplate: protect the institution or defend his child. For months, William assumed he knew the complete story, but in actuality, he'd been kept in the dark, purposefully. Under orders from higher authorities, senior aides screened and censored all reports and updates presenting a more politically convenient and manageable account of Louis's condition. The real diagnosis was concealed, stored in sensitive folders William never saw. Furthermore, the truth did not come to him through an official briefing. It came in the form of a secret report Catherine had uncovered, stashed away in a restricted repository. Everything changed at that point. Sources inside the palace indicate William erupted when he realized the full scope of Louis' condition. His wrath wasn't simply about dishonesty. It was about betrayal. People closest to him, people he trusted with national leadership, had prioritized formality above fatherhood. Charles, purportedly confronted in a closed-door meeting, gave a horrifying comment that still rings through royal circles. This cannot reach the public, ever. The weight of that demand destroyed something inside William. His friendship with Catherine grew strained, not because they disagreed on what to do. However, they were both aware that there were no more good options. Catherine desired openness. William feared collapse. Their union, so frequently a tower of strength, suddenly felt shaky. The breaking point came weeks later when Camilla sought to intervene. A portion of the conversation was allegedly recorded by a security guard who was stationed right outside the royal apartments. William's voice, loud and quivering, could be heard saying, "Don't you dare talk to me about duty when it's my kid you want silenced." The disclosure of the recording sent tremors across every corridor in Buckingham. It was no longer merely a family argument. It was a full-scale breach. William disappeared from public obligations for a few days out of desperation. Where he went, nobody knew, but flight records eventually revealed an unannounced trip to the United States, where he visited a top neurogenetic institute under an alias. There, for the first time, he spoke freely, not as a prince, not as a figurehead, but as a worried father, wondering what little hope yet remained for his kid. When he returned, he placed a secure call to Prince Harry. Despite their alienation, William trusted no one else. For nearly 2 hours they spoke, and what followed changed everything. Harry, hardened by his own struggle with the establishment, didn't mince words. You have two alternatives. Bury this like they want, or blow it open and let the world judge. William remained silent, but those close to him think his silence spoke loudly. William went to a high-level palace meeting a few days later. He listened in quiet while aides advocated a new strategy of controlled communications. After listening to their spiel and nodding through their slides, he got up, met each advisor's gaze, and declared, "You've had your chance. Now, it's my turn." But while William teetered on the edge of rebellion, fate interfered, and it came in the shape of the one woman most feared by the palace. Just as the palace rushed to manage the flames, Meghan Markle re-entered the picture with leverage. Armed with private papers and a powerful media relationship, she promised to destroy the monarchy's veneer if justice wasn't given for Louis. But was she a savior or a strategic opportunist? Her comeback wasn't subtle. It was clearly loud, well-timed, and deliberate. Meghan's name started trending globally within hours of the leak becoming viral. Not for scandal, but for something far more perilous to the organization. Evidence suggests she claimed to possess recordings from inside the palace, blurry tapes, reportedly showing Louis during private therapy sessions. In them, assistants could be heard mumbling commands, obscuring cameras, and in one tragic moment, stopping the youngster mid-sentence. How she obtained this footage remains a mystery. Some think it came from a sympathetic staff member. Others believe it was part of a wider intelligence operation involving many insiders. What mattered more was what she meant to do with it, because Meghan wasn't just upset, she was prepared. And planned documentary series called Royal Exposé, The Louis Files, was part of her new production agreement, which she discreetly signed with one of the biggest streaming services in the world. The announcement alone plunged the palace into a full-scale panic. For years, the royal family had controlled the narrative. Now that control was loosening, and Meghan, ostracized, chastised, rejected, was holding the detonator. Behind closed doors, a tense encounter was scheduled. Meghan flew into Windsor with tight secrecy. The meeting with William and Catherine was not warm. It was terrible, bitter, and raw. According to witnesses, Catherine struggled to remain composed. At one point, she reportedly sobbed excessively, imploring Meghan, "Why would you do this to him now?" Meghan's reply, equally cruel, was straightforward, "Because you had the opportunity to do it, but chose not to." But this wasn't just personal retaliation. Meghan made demands when she arrived. They went right to the core of the monarchy's most profound hypocrisies. She accused the palace of advocating mental health efforts in public, while covertly damaging a child's chance at support and visibility. She wanted legislative changes, transparency in how royal children receive treatment, and an end to the institutional cover-ups that had obscured Louis's illness for years. It wasn't just about Louis anymore. Meghan was releasing the floodgates to every whispered scandal, every repressed fact, and behind her stood Harry, who was now the last line of defense between his wife and the monarchy, rather than the outsider. He made one point plain in a protected call with an advisor close to the king. Everything that occurs to Meghan is made public, unedited, and uncensored, unrecoverable. The palace was in a tight spot. The press was circling. Global interest was growing like a wave waiting to crash. And for the first time since Diana's death, the monarchy wasn't only under pressure, it was under siege. The palace now faced its most terrible moment since Diana's death. An urgent choice made behind closed doors would determine if the monarchy survived. A clandestine gathering in the middle of night. Under complete blackout procedures, advisors, monarchists, and medical leaders meet. Their mission: determine Prince Louis's fate. And potentially, the future of the crown. The clock is ticking, and the possibilities are terrible. What they picked will haunt history. It was named the Windsor Contingency, an unrecorded summit summoned by King Charles himself, behind reinforced palace walls and cleansed of any digital trace. No phones, no aides, just a dozen men and ladies, each having a singular function: maintenance of the monarchy at whatever cost. The stakes were no longer speculative. Meghan's threats, William's intransigence, and the mounting global fury had pushed the institution to its most explosive brink since the abdication of Edward VIII. The environment in the chamber was chilly, clinical. The agenda did not include compassion. One idea, swiftly gaining support, asked for the total banishment of Prince Louis from public life. No images, no appearances, a gradual disappearance under the pretense of protecting privacy. A different, much more radical voice advocated for William to completely resign and give Charlotte the reins of power, who could be positioned as the new face of stability through public grooming. But the most ominous recommendation of all came from a high-ranking medical liaison who urged that Louis be publicly deemed non-viable for public duty. A bureaucratic statement designed to prevent the institution from ever having to address his future again. In essence, they intended to write the boy out of history, while still flaunting a sanitized version of the facts to placate the press. When Catherine was summoned to attend, she refused flatly. Her silence was a protest louder than any words. William did appear, but he didn't stay long. He allegedly departed midway through, slamming the old door behind him, according to witnesses, refusing to be part of what he reportedly called a sacrificial strategy, masquerading as strategy. That left Charles cold, stressed, and physically fatigued to deliver the final decision. No complete confession would be made, no open reckoning. Rather, they would issue a carefully crafted statement that acknowledged Louis's diagnosis but downplayed its seriousness, a gesture of transparency without actual accountability, a preemptive measure to calm public unrest while maintaining internal control. The phrase was carefully constructed. Words like continual care, small challenges, and family privacy were selected to soften the reality. The palace would maintain its narrative grasp for now, but what none of them could see, what none of their models projected, was that the world had already moved beyond well-chosen words, because this wasn't just about a youngster. It was about a betrayal, a cover-up, a crown that put legacy over life. One item, however, had been overlooked by the monarchy. The public's demand for truth and what occurred next would send shockwaves around the world. Within hours, the planet ignited. Hashtags trended. Protests erupted outside Buckingham. Millions of parents, medical ethicists, and proponents of children's rights came together to support Louis. The royal family, previously untouchable, was now on trial, not in court, but in the court of global opinion. The headline was like a blow to the stomach: "The Crown's Cruel Secret." It ran across every major news channel, from London to Los Angeles, Tokyo to Toronto. For decades, the monarchy had managed to shelter itself from the chaos of modern exposure. But not this time. This time, the veil was torn away in real time, and there was no process established for what occurred next. The leaked footage, raw, emotional, and obviously authentic, spread like wildfire. Once limited to the nursery, Catherine's private cries suddenly reverberated across every gadget on the planet. In one film, she could be heard sobbing, whispering, "They're choosing the crown over my child." That single line became a rallying cry. Hashtag Justice for Louis shot to the top of trending lists on the internet. Candles were lighted under pictures of the little prince in the streets. Around the globe, families saw not royalty, but themselves. Unprecedented declarations were made by leaders of democratic countries. The Prime Minister of Canada urged urgent openness from the palace. New Zealand's parliament asked for a reassessment of how Commonwealth nations assist monarchs. Even the White House, which is usually circumspect when it comes to foreign internal affairs, released a statement calling for empathy, responsibility, and putting kid care ahead of institutional preservation. What had started as a leak became a reckoning. Public sympathy for Louis translated into political pressure. Petitions developed calling for constitutional amendments, asking why hereditary institutions were permitted to work in darkness, immune to the moral standards of the same people they represent. Critics of the monarchy sensed blood. Supporters found themselves in turmoil, questioning whether loyalty to the crown now meant cooperation in cruelty. Within royal circles, the pressure rose alarmingly. Reports swirled that King Charles, under enormous stress, had begun to suffer memory lapses during high-level meetings. Some insiders whispered that senior royals were already drafting contingency measures for an early transfer of power. As murmurs of abdication once again hung through the air, like a curse no one wanted to say aloud. However, the younger generation was emerging as a new force amid the upheaval. William, Catherine, even Charlotte were suddenly considered not as symbols, but as survivors of a failed system. Public mood began to change toward them not as heirs, but as prospective reformers. As the world wanted answers, they stood at the edge of a storm they didn't cause, but might be obliged to lead through. One thing was evident. The period of uncontested veneration was over. Myth, mystery, and control had long been the crown's lifeblood. But now that its secrets were visible on every screen, a question surfaced more loudly than before. Could it survive the truth? Because there is more to this than a covert diagnosis. It's about what type of monarchy survives in a world no longer willing to be lied to. I appreciate you watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.